The words left her mouth like a bullet she had not meant to fire, and the moment they struck him, she watched something behind his eyes shatter quietly, the way ice cracks beneath a boot before the cold water rushes in. "I cannot be your reason to stay," Adelaide Eston said, her voice low and trembling, her hands pressed flat against the rough wooden railing of the porch as if the earth itself might give way beneath her if she let go. The wind moved through the tall grass of the Colorado plains in long, slow waves, indifferent to the wreckage between them. The last orange light of the evening bled across the horizon, painting the sky in shades of fire and surrender, and Wade Olson stood at the base of those porch steps, hat in his hand, jaw tight, looking up at her with an expression she had been terrified of seeing for months. It was not anger. She could have handled anger. It was something far more dangerous. It was certainty. He took one step up, then another. "You already are," he said. She turned her face away, blinking fast, pressing her lips together until they went white. Because she had told herself, over and over again across 4 seasons and 100 quiet moments and every accidental brush of hands in the barn and every slow conversation under the stars, that this could not happen, that she could not let it happen, that she was not the kind of woman who got to have this, not with everything she was carrying, not with everything that was coming. "Wade." Her voice broke on his name. "Adelaide, you do not understand what you are asking. I am not asking anything." He stepped onto the porch, and he was close enough now that she could see the dust on his collar and the tiredness in his face that had nothing to do with the long days of work and everything to do with her. "I am telling you what is true." She finally looked at him, and the looking was a mistake, because once she looked at his face she could not stop, and she hated herself for it. She hated herself for the way her heart rose toward him like a plant reaching for the only light in a dark room. "There are things you do not know about me," she whispered. "Then tell me." She shook her head, slow, and the grief in her eyes was old and deep and layered, the kind that does not come from one wound but from many, stacked atop each other across years. "If I tell you," she said, "you will understand why you have to leave." He did not move. He just stood there in the warm, terrible light of the dying day, holding his hat, steady as the mountains at their backs, and said nothing. And that silence, that absolute, unshakable silence, was what finally broke her open. It had begun 8 months earlier, in the autumn of 1882, when Adelaide Eston rode into the town of Calder Creek, Colorado, on a sorrel mare with a cracked saddle and $40 sewn into the hem of her skirt, carrying nothing else of value except a name that was not entirely her own anymore. She had come from Abilene, Kansas, though she told no one that. To the people of Calder Creek, she was simply a widow from back east looking to start fresh, which was a story close enough to the truth that the lie never made her choke. She had been married. That part was real. And Henry Eston was dead. That part was also real. The rest of it, the circumstances of that death, the man who had caused it, the agreement she had signed, and the secrets she had witnessed, those were the things she kept locked behind her ribs like a loaded pistol, ready to fire in the wrong direction at the wrong moment. Calder Creek was a small cattle town with a main street wide enough for 2 wagons to pass side by side, and a population of roughly 200 souls, give or take the seasonal ranch hands and the drifters who moved through in the direction of New Mexico or Utah. There was a general store run by a man named Gideon Farr, a saloon called the Prairie Belle, a church that leaned slightly to the west, and a doctor named Elias Prout, who smelled of tobacco and was usually reliable. There was also a land office, a sheriff named Clarence Dodd who was decent enough but cautious in the way of a man who has survived by choosing his battles carefully, and a schoolhouse that had been without a teacher for 3 months. It was the schoolhouse that brought Adelaide to Calder Creek. She had seen the advertisement in a newspaper she had picked up at a stage stop in Pueblo, and the position had called to her the way lighthouses call to ships in fog, not because she was particularly lost, but because she was tired of moving and needed a reason to stop. She presented herself to the town council on a Tuesday morning in late October, dressed in her best dark blue dress, her hair pulled back tight, and she answered every question they put to her with the quiet precision of a woman who has learned to manage first impressions the way a card dealer manages a deck. She had taught before, briefly, in Abilene. She knew her letters and her numbers, and she had a natural steadiness with children that came partly from temperament and partly from the fact that children, unlike most adults, did not expect you to explain yourself. The council hired her. She rented a room above the millinery shop from a woman named Dorothea Hatch, who was forthright and kind and asked very few questions, which Adelaide considered a gift from heaven. She taught school 5 days a week in that small leaning building, 22 children between the ages of 6 and 14, and she was good at it. She was patient and firm and occasionally funny, and by December, the children of Calder Creek had stopped thinking of her as the strange newcomer and started thinking of her as simply Miss Eston, the way children claim people they trust. She met Wade Olson in November, 3 weeks after she arrived. She had gone to the general store to purchase chalk and a box of primers, and he was there at the counter buying a length of fence wire and a sack of flour, speaking with Gideon far in the unhurried way of a man who had nowhere urgent to be and no need to pretend otherwise. He was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair that curled slightly at the back of his neck, and a face that was weathered in the honest way of men who work outdoors by choice, not by desperation. His hands were large and calloused, and when he turned and saw her standing there, he did not look her over the way some men did, weighing and measuring. He simply looked at her face, nodded once, and said, "Morning." "Good morning," she said. Gideon Farr made the introduction. "Miss Eston, this here is Wade Olson. Runs the Running O Ranch about 4 miles south. Been here since, 78? 77, Wade said without particular pride. He extended his hand and she shook it, and his grip was firm and brief and respectful. "You are the new school teacher," he said. "I am. My nephew Tommy is in your class. Red-haired boy, sits in the back and draws horses on his slate when he thinks you are not looking." A brief warmth moved across her face. "I had noticed. He is quite good." Wade studied her for a half-second longer than the introduction required, not intrusively but with the quiet attention of a man who listens carefully. And then he turned back to his business with Gideon, and she turned to hers, and that was all. But Calder Creek was small, and lives in small towns intersect in ways that cities do not allow, and over the following weeks she kept encountering him. At church on Sundays, where he sat in the third pew from the back and sang hymns with unpretentious sincerity. At the sheriff's office one afternoon when she had gone to report a broken window at the schoolhouse that she suspected was deliberate, and he was there discussing a fence dispute with Clarence Dodd. At the Prairie Belle's lunch counter, which served a decent beef stew on Wednesdays and was one of the only places in town where a woman eating alone was unremarkable. She learned things about him in the accumulative way you learn things about people in small towns, through the information that floats freely in the air of such places. He was 31 years old. He had come to Colorado from Missouri at 26 with 160 acres, a dream, and an absolute refusal to quit. He had built the Running O from nothing, through 2 brutal winters and a drought and a cattle sickness that had killed a third of his herd in his second year. He had no wife. He had no interest, so far as anyone could tell, in acquiring one, though several women in town had made their interest in the subject clear. He was steady and private and fair, and men who worked for him tended to stay, which in 1882 Colorado was the highest possible endorsement of a man's character. His nephew Tommy, she discovered, was the son of Wade's younger sister Ruth, who had died of fever 2 years earlier. Tommy lived with his father Cal, a good man with a drinking problem and intermittent bouts of responsibility, and Wade kept a careful, quiet watch over the boy the way a man keeps watch over something precious that he is not certain he can protect. Tommy was 11, bright and restless and starving for the kind of steady attention that his home life did not reliably provide, and Adelaide recognized it in him immediately because she had been something like that herself, years ago. She began keeping him after school on Tuesdays and Thursdays to help clean the chalkboards and organize the primers, which gave him something to do with his hands and gave her someone to talk to in the late afternoon light when the schoolhouse was otherwise empty. It was in December on a Thursday that Tommy said to her while stacking primers on the shelf, "My Uncle Wade said you are the best teacher Calder Creek has ever had." She kept her expression neutral. "That is kind of him to say. He said it to Sheriff Dodd. I heard him. He did not know I was listening." She said nothing to that, but later that evening, sitting at the small writing table in her room above the millinery, she found herself thinking about it longer than she should have. The trouble arrived in January. His name was Fletcher Dade, and he rode into Calder Creek on a gray horse with a silver-mounted saddle, wearing a long black coat and a smile that was the most dangerous kind, the kind that looked genuine. He took a room at the Calder Creek Hotel and introduced himself as a land speculator from Denver, and for 3 days he moved through town like a friendly shadow, buying drinks at the Prairie Bell and chatting with Gideon Farr and attending Sunday service with an expression of pious interest that made Adelaide's blood run cold the moment she saw his face. Because she knew Fletcher Dade, she knew him from Abilene. She knew him from the night her husband Henry had come home pale and shaking, the night he had told her in a low voice that he had witnessed something he should not have, that Fletcher Dade had killed a man named Porter Reeves over a land deed dispute, that it had not been self-defense, that it had been deliberate, and that Henry had been standing close enough to the window of the land office to see the whole thing happen. She knew from the expression on Henry's face that night that he was already calculating whether survival was possible, and from the expression on Henry's face 3 weeks later, just before the wagon accident that no one in Abilene had questioned, she knew that survival had turned out not to be. She did not go to the sheriff in Abilene. She had tried once to speak quietly to the deputy, and within 48 hours Fletcher Dade had appeared at her door with that same steady smile and told her in a voice so pleasant. It was almost courteous that her husband's death had been a tragic accident, and that accidents have a way of running in families when families get confused about what they know and do not know. She had understood him perfectly. She had packed her things and been gone within a week, and now he was here. She did not know in those first days whether he had followed her or whether this was the worst coincidence of her life. She kept to her regular patterns, taught her classes, spoke to Dorothea at breakfast as usual, and tried to calculate her options with the cold precision of a woman who has learned that panic is a luxury she cannot afford. On the third day, he sat down across from her at the lunch counter of the Prairie Bell while she was eating her Wednesday stew. "Miss Eston," he said pleasantly, as if they were old friends renewing an acquaintance, which in the worst possible sense they were. "What a remarkable coincidence." "Mr. Dade," she said. He stirred a spoon in his coffee. His eyes were light gray and entirely still. Lovely little town. I can see why a person might want to put down roots here. I imagine you will not be staying long, she said, keeping her voice level. That depends entirely, he said, on how my business goes. He left shortly after, and she sat with her stew growing cold in front of her, staring at the grain of the wooden table and did the arithmetic of her situation. Fletcher Dade was not a man who made idle threats or wasted trips. He had come here for a reason. Either he wanted to ensure her continued silence, or he had some other business in Calder Creek that she was not yet aware of, or both. The fact that he had not already done anything violent suggested he preferred negotiation to force when negotiation was available, which meant he believed he could control her through fear, which meant he had not changed. She decided that evening, alone in her room with the lamp burning low, that she would give him nothing. She would not run again. She was tired of running. She was 30 years old and she had already run from one life, and she was not going to surrender this one without a fight, even if she was not yet certain what form that fight would take. What she did not decide, and what was already becoming a problem she could not entirely manage, was Wade Olson. Because Wade Olson had taken to walking her home from the school on Tuesdays and Thursdays, ostensibly because he came to collect Tommy, and while Tommy raced ahead through the brown winter grass with his slate under his arm, Wade walked beside her at a pace that was unhurried and companionable and somehow deeply comfortable, the way certain silences are comfortable, and they talked about small things that turned, almost without her noticing, into large things. He told her about the drought of 1879, and the way he had watched his second year's herd die, and the choice he had faced between quitting and continuing, and how he had stayed because leaving would have meant he had failed not just himself, but something he believed in about what a man could build with his hands and his will in this country. She told him, carefully and selectively, about teaching in Kansas. She told him about the way certain children arrived already damaged by the world, and how sometimes the only gift a teacher could give them was a space where they were expected to be capable rather than simply tolerated. She was careful not to tell him too much, and she was careful not to ask him too many questions, because asking questions creates the expectation of answers, and she was in no position to answer questions. But despite all her care, something was happening between them, quiet and persistent and entirely unwelcome, the way a spring thaw happens in the earth before you can see it on the surface. He brought firewood to the schoolhouse in February without being asked, because he had noticed the wood pile was getting low. She thanked him and did not make a fuss of it, and he waved it off with the same uncomplicated directness with which he did most things. He fixed the broken window. He brought Tommy to school on stormy mornings on horseback, which was 2 miles out of his way. He stopped at the Prairie Belle one Wednesday when he saw her there and bought her coffee without asking, which would have annoyed her if the coffee had not arrived at exactly the moment she needed it. These were not courtship gestures, she told herself. They were simply the actions of a decent man in a community where people helped each other. This was the West. People did these things. She mostly believed herself, until the evening in late February when they were walking back from the school and it had begun to snow, light and early, and they had stood together at the edge of the main street watching the snow come down in the lamplight, and he had said quietly, without looking at her, "I have not spent this much time talking to anyone in a long while." She had not said anything, but her heart had done something she had not given it permission to do. Fletcher Dade, meanwhile, had extended his stay at the hotel. His stated business was negotiating the purchase of a parcel of land east of town, and he was patient and thorough about it in a way that gave Adelaide the cold sensation that his real business was something else entirely, that the land purchase was cover. She found out what it was in March, when Gideon Farr mentioned in passing at the general store that some fellow from Denver was asking questions about the Running O Ranch, about its acreage and water rights, and whether Wade Olson had taken on any debt in recent years. She went very still at the counter. "What kind of questions?" she asked. Gideon shrugged. "Business questions, I reckon. Man said he was looking for investment opportunities." She paid for her chalk and walked out into the gray March afternoon and stood in the cold for a long moment, thinking. She did not know why Fletcher Dade would want the Running O. The ranch was prosperous, but it was not extraordinary, not obviously more valuable than a dozen other spreads in the county. Unless the value was not in the land itself, but in something else, some position or resource or access that she was not seeing yet, she began paying more deliberate attention. She listened when she was at the general store. She chatted with Dorothea, who knew everything that moved through Calder Creek, with a casualness that concealed her purpose. And she found, bit by bit, that a new railroad survey was being conducted through the county, that the surveyors had been through in the fall before she arrived, and that the most direct route from Colorado Springs through the mountains to the Utah Territory ran directly across the southeastern corner of the Running O Ranch. Railroad access, water rights, strategic position on a future line worth millions. Fletcher Dade had not followed her to Calder Creek. He had come here for the railroad rights, and she had simply been the unlucky coincidence. But he had seen her, and now he had two problems in one town, and she knew from experience that Fletcher Dade was a man who preferred to solve problems economically, meaning in ways that solved multiple issues at once. She understood now what he wanted from her, not just silence, cooperation. She was the schoolteacher. She was trusted by this community. She had access and relationships and a respectable face that a man like Dade, known in other counties, could not easily manufacture. He wanted her to be useful to him, and the threat beneath that want was the same one she had lived with since Abilene. She spent 3 days thinking about whether to tell Wade. The arguments against telling him were substantial. She barely knew him, despite the way it felt. Telling him would mean revealing her past, which would mean revealing the truth about Henry's death and Dade's role in it, and her own flight from Abilene. And any of those revelations could end her life in Calder Creek, just as surely as Dade's threats. It would mean making him a target, because any man who knew what she knew became a liability in Fletcher Dade's accounting. The arguments for telling him were fewer but heavier. He was at risk regardless of whether she told him. Dade was already making inquiries about his ranch. He was already, almost certainly, developing a plan to acquire it through whatever combination of pressure and legal maneuvering and darker methods he preferred. And Wade was a man who moved through the world with a kind of open confidence that Adelaide recognized as the specific vulnerability of people who have not yet been targeted by someone who operates in shadows. He did not know what was coming. She decided she would not tell him. She decided this several times with great firmness, and then she undecided it on a Thursday afternoon in late March, when Tommy stayed after school and showed her a drawing he had made of the Running O at sunrise, the farmhouse and the barn and the long fields, and said with the absolute certainty of an 11-year-old, "Uncle Wade says the Running O will still be here when I grow up. He says he is going to leave it to me someday," she said. "That is a very fine drawing, Tommy." She went to see Wade the following Saturday morning. The Running O was 4 miles south of town, and she rode the sorrel mare down the dirt road in the early spring light with her jaw set, and her hands steady on the reins and her stomach in a state of quiet revolution. The ranch opened up around a bend in the road, and she saw the farmhouse first, A solid two-story structure built of local timber and stone, modest but well-made, with a covered porch running across the front and a kitchen garden already turned over and waiting for planting along the south wall. The barn was large and in good repair, and the fenced pasture beyond it held a good-sized herd of cattle and half a dozen horses. It was the kind of place built to last, the kind of place someone had poured years of themselves into. She understood Tommy's drawing differently now that she was seeing it, understood the weight behind those simple lines. Wade was in the yard repairing a saddle when she arrived, and he looked up at the sound of hooves with an expression that shifted, just briefly, into something unguarded before he brought it back under control. "Miss Eston," he said, setting down his tools and standing. "This is unexpected." "I know," she said, dismounting. "I need to talk to you about something serious." He read her face with the directness he brought to everything. "All right," he said, and gestured toward the porch. "Come, sit down." She told him most of it. She did not tell him everything, because she was not yet ready to tell him everything, but she told him enough. She told him that Fletcher Dade was not the man he was presenting himself to be, that she knew him from Abilene, that she had reason to believe he had killed a man there over a land dispute, and had used threats to silence the only witness. She told him about the railroad survey route, and why she believed the running O was Dade's real target. She told him to be careful about any legal documents or offers he might receive regarding the ranch, to speak with a lawyer before signing anything, and to be aware that Dade was a patient and methodical man who worked through legitimate-seeming channels whenever possible. She did not tell him about Henry. She did not tell him the depth of the threat against herself. She told herself it was because those details were not relevant to the warning about his ranch, which was partly true. Wade listened without interrupting, seated on the porch step with his forearms resting on his knees, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment. "How do you know this man?" he asked. "He came through Abilene when I was living there," she said. "He had business with my late husband." Another beat of silence. "Your husband knew him?" "Yes. And after your husband died," she met his eyes, "I left Abilene." He held her gaze for a long moment, and she could see him calculating what she had told him against what she had not told him, and she could see that he understood there was a significant gap between the two. But he did not push. He simply nodded once and said, "Thank you for telling me." "Be careful," she said, and stood to go. "Adelaide." It was the first time he had used her given name. She stopped. "If you are in danger from this man," he said, "I want to know." "I can manage my own affairs," she said, and it came out more sharply than she intended. "I know you can," he said, without any defensiveness, which was somehow more difficult to manage than an argument would have been. "I am not suggesting otherwise. I am saying that you do not have to manage them alone." She looked at him standing there in his yard, in front of the home he had built with his own hands, and she thought about what it would mean to let someone stand beside her instead of in front of her, shielding her, which she did not need, or behind her, as a burden, which she refused to be. Just beside her. She could not remember the last time she had considered the possibility. "I will keep it in mind," she said, and rode away. April came in soft and green, and Calder Creek moved into the rhythms of spring planting and branding season, and Fletcher Dade remained at the hotel and remained patient, and Adelaide watched him the way you watch a river that is rising, steadily and without panic, but with absolute attention. He came to the school one afternoon in mid-April. He stood in the doorway while she was finishing the day's lessons, his hat in his hand and his smile in place, and the children looked at him with the instinctive wariness that children sometimes show to adults whose warmth does not match something else they are communicating without words. She dismissed the class calmly, waited until the last child had gone, and turned to face him. "What do you want, Mr. Dade?" she said. He stepped inside and looked around the schoolroom with apparent appreciation. "A fine little establishment. You have done well here, Adelaide. Mrs. Eston," she said. He tilted his head. "Of course, Mrs. Eston." He sat down, uninvited, on one of the front benches. "I wanted to have an honest conversation." "Then be honest," she said. He was quiet for a moment, arranging his thoughts in the way of a man who chooses each word as a deliberate instrument. "I know that you have been speaking to Wade Olson about me," he said. "I have ears in this town. I want you to understand that whatever you may have told him, it changes nothing. He is a rancher. He knows cattle and fence wire. He does not know how to fight what is coming, and neither, frankly, do you." "What is coming?" she asked. "Progress," he said pleasantly. "The railroad. The land deals that come with it. These things happen with or without the cooperation of individual residents, Mrs. Eston. The only question is whether those residents choose to be reasonable. And what does reasonable look like to you?" He met her eyes, and for just a moment the pleasantness fell away, and she saw the thing underneath it, the thing she had first seen through a window in Abilene, cold and absolute and entirely without remorse. "It looks like you stopping your conversations with Olson. It looks like you going about your school teaching and your quiet little life, and leaving the business of land and railroads to people who understand it. And it looks like you remembering that accidents have a way of repeating themselves in the lives of people who cannot manage their own affairs." She did not flinch. She had promised herself she would not flinch. "I will think about what you have said," she told him. He stood, smiled, replaced his hat. "You are a sensible woman. I always thought so." He walked to the door and paused. "Give my regards to young Tommy Olson. Bright boy. It would be terrible if anything disrupted his education." He left, and she stood in the empty schoolroom for a long time, looking at the students' drawings pinned to the wall and the chalk equations still on the board, and she understood that the threat had just expanded. He was not only threatening her, he was threatening the boy. He was threatening the whole fragile, careful world she had built in 8 months in this town. And that was the moment she stopped being afraid and started being angry. She went to see Sheriff Clarence Dodd that evening. She had not gone to him before because she had not believed it would do any good, and her experience in Abilene had not given her confidence in the willingness of law officers to take on well-dressed, well-resourced men like Fletcher Dade. But she had run out of other options, and Clarence Dodd was, at minimum, a decent man. She told him everything. All of it this time, including Henry's death and the deputy in Abilene and her own flight. She watched his face as she talked, looking for the signs that he was already calculating retreat, and she did not see them. He was a cautious man, but he was listening carefully, and when she finished he was quiet for a long moment, and then he said, "I am going to need to write to the sheriff in Abilene. That is going to take time." "I know," she said. "In the meantime," he said, "I want you to stay away from Dade as much as possible. Do not meet with him alone, and I want to know immediately if he approaches you again." "What about the Olson Ranch?" she said. Dodd rubbed the back of his neck. "I will talk to Wade. I know him. He is a reasonable man. He needs to understand what he is dealing with." She thanked him and left, and walked back to the millinery in the early evening, and sat at her writing table, and wrote a letter to the county land office in Pueblo, requesting information on the railroad survey and any pending land acquisition filings in Calder Creek County. She did not know exactly what she was looking for, but she knew that Fletcher Dade's power came from operating in the spaces between legitimate and illegitimate, and that the way to expose him was to make those spaces visible. She also thought, sitting at that small table with her lamp burning, about what she was doing and why she was doing it, and who she was doing it for. And she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge that protecting Tommy was not the only reason. That protecting the running O and the man who had built it was not incidental. She went to bed before she could follow that thought any further. The letter from the Pueblo land office arrived in 2 weeks. She read it at the general store, standing at the counter while Gideon Farr tactfully pretended to inventory a shelf of canned goods behind her. And what she found in it made her breath go very still. Fletcher Dade had already filed a legal claim against a portion of the running O's water rights, citing an obscure territorial statute from 1876 that allowed a third party to contest water rights in cases where a parcel of land could be demonstrated to have been originally deeded with incomplete boundary surveys. The claim was currently being reviewed by the Territorial Land Court in Denver. It was legitimate, barely, technically, and it was the kind of thing that could take years to resolve and cost a rancher more in legal fees than the water rights were worth if the rancher did not know what was happening until it was too late. She folded the letter, put it in her pocket, and went directly to Wade Olson. He was at the running O with his foreman, a quiet man named Samuel Greer who had been with the ranch since the beginning. And when she rode up, he took one look at her face and said something to Greer and walked toward her. "What happened?" he said. She pulled out the letter and handed it to him without speaking. He read it standing in the yard with the spring sun on his face, and she watched his expression move through surprise, and then a cold, careful anger that was nothing like violence and everything like resolve. "He moved fast," Wade said. "He is always moving," she said. "He just does it where you cannot see it until he wants you to." He looked up from the letter. "How did you get this?" "I wrote to the land office in Pueblo." He studied her face. "You have been working on this?" "Yes." Something shifted in his expression, something she had not seen there before. Not gratitude exactly, something more complicated than gratitude. Something that had to do with the specific surprise of a man who has been carrying a heavy thing alone for a long time and suddenly discovers that someone else has been standing beside him, lifting. "Come inside," he said. "We need to figure out what to do." They sat at the kitchen table, the two of them, with the letter between them and a pot of coffee on the stove that Wade made without asking and placed in front of her without ceremony. And they talked for 2 hours. They went through everything she knew about Dade's methods and everything he knew about the history of his own water rights. They talked about the territorial land court process and what a legal challenge would require. They talked about getting a lawyer from Pueblo. At some point the conversation slid sideways, the way conversations do when the practical business has been worked through, and what remains is the thing that was underneath the practical business all along. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, not accusingly, just asking. She looked at her coffee cup. "Because it is the right thing to do." "Adelaide," she looked up at his face. "Because I am tired of Fletcher Dade ruining people's lives and walking away clean," she said. "Because your ranch should not be his next success story. Because Tommy drew a picture of this place and told me you were going to leave it to him someday." She stopped. He waited. "And because," she said, and stopped again and looked away and then looked back, because she had decided some weeks ago that she was done running from things. "Because I do not want you to lose it." The kitchen was very quiet. Outside a horse shifted in the paddock and the spring wind moved through the yard and the sun was going in the direction of afternoon. "That is a considerable amount of caring," he said, "for someone who told me she could manage her own affairs." She almost said something dismissive. She had the words ready, but she did not say them. She sat with the truth of what she had said and let it stay in the room between them. "I am aware," she said quietly, "that it is considerably more than is sensible." "Why is it not sensible?" he asked. And here was the place she had been avoiding. Here was the edge she had been walking around for months carefully, the way you walk around a drop in the dark. "Because I do not have a clear life," she said. "I have a past that is complicated and a present that is dangerous and a man who has already killed one person connected to me. I am not," she said, and her voice was steady but her hands were not, "a safe person to be connected to right now." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with the absolute directness she had come to understand was simply how he was built, "I am a rancher in 1882 Colorado, Adelaide. Safe is not a condition I was expecting." She looked at him and felt the thing she had been holding back for months press hard against the inside of her ribs, demanding. "It is not a joke," she said. "I know it is not," he said. His voice was gentle. "I know exactly what you are telling me, and I am telling you that I heard it, and it does not change anything for me. Wade, I am not asking you to decide anything today," he said. "I am just telling you the truth. That is all I know how to do." She stood up from the table and walked to the window and stood looking out at the yard, at the barn and the pasture and the clean, simple fact of what he had built. And she thought about Henry, who had been a decent man and a weak one, and the way she had loved him without quite trusting him, which had been its own particular grief. She thought about Abilene and the running and the long, cold year of being no one in particular anywhere. She thought about what it would mean to stop. "There is more you do not know about me," she said to the window. "Then tell me," he said, "when you are ready." She turned around. He was still at the table, still with his coffee, looking at her with an expression that was patient and steady, and entirely without the anxiety of a man who needs you to be something particular. "All right," she said after a moment. "Not today, but all right." The response from the Abilene sheriff arrived in late May. Clarence Dodd brought it to her personally, which told her something about its contents before she had opened it. He sat across from her in his office with his hands flat on the desk, and his face holding the careful expression of a man who is about to say something complicated. The letter confirmed that a man named Porter Reeves had died in Abilene in August of 1880, that the death had been ruled accidental at the time, that the investigating deputy at the time had been a man named Marcus Farlow, and that Marcus Farlow had resigned his position in October of 1880 and moved to New Mexico Territory, destination unknown. The letter also noted that the current Abilene sheriff had reopened the Reeves investigation 6 months ago based on new information and was seeking witnesses, and that Adelaide Eston was listed as a person of interest in that investigation. A person of interest. She felt the words settle on her like a cold hand. "That means they want my testimony," she said. "Yes," Dodd said. "It means that, and it may also mean Dade knows the investigation has been reopened and that is why he is here, not just for the railroad land, for you. To make sure you do not go back to Abilene and give testimony." She absorbed this slowly. "He cannot stop me from giving testimony if I am already in Abilene giving it." "No," Dodd agreed. "He can only stop you from getting there." The silence in his office was the particular silence of a moment where the shape of a danger becomes fully visible. "I need to write to the Abilene sheriff," she said. "I already wrote to him last night," Dodd said. "When I received the letter I wrote back immediately." He paused. "Adelaide, I want you to understand that you are not in this alone. I have already spoken to Wade Olson, and I have a deputy I trust completely, and between us we can keep you safe while this gets sorted out. But I need you to be careful, and I need you to tell me if Dade makes any move against you." She nodded. She felt suddenly, unexpectedly moved by the plainness of his decency, by the way he had simply said "I wrote to him last night," as if that were the obvious thing to do when someone needed protecting. "Thank you, Clarence," she said. She rode out to the running that afternoon. Wade was in the north pasture when she arrived, and Samuel Greer went to find him while she waited in the yard. And when he came across the field toward her, still 100 yards away, something in the way he walked, unhurried and direct and as reliable as the ground itself, made her throat tighten in a way she did not try to prevent. She told him what Dot had told her. He listened, standing beside her at the paddock fence, looking out at the horses while she talked, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment. "So he came here to make sure you could not testify," he said. "That is what I believe. And the land claim against the running is leverage. If I am fighting a legal battle over my water rights, I do not have time or resources to be helping you." She had not quite put it together in those terms, but as soon as he said it, she knew he was right. Yes, he is very thorough. He turned and looked at her. "What do you want to do?" It was such a simple question. Not what should we do, not what do I think you should do. What do you want? She had to take a breath before she could answer. "I want to write my testimony down, everything I witnessed and everything Henry told me, and send it to the Abilene sheriff by post so that even if something happens to me before I can testify in person, the record exists." He nodded. "That is smart. Do it today. I also want to find out if there are other people in the county who have been threatened or cheated by Dade in connection with this railroad project. If there are other witnesses, his case becomes much harder to manage." "I know the county commissioner in Pueblo," Wade said. "Man named Arthur Gaines. I can ride there and talk to him." "That is a 2-day ride." "Yes," she looked at him. "You do not have to do that." He met her eyes with the steady patience she had come to love, and then stopped that thought before it completed itself, and then let it complete itself, because she had decided she was done running. "I want to," he said. She wrote her testimony that night. 6 pages of careful, clear handwriting. Every detail she could remember of the night Henry had come home shaking, and everything he had told her, and the specific nature of the threats Dade had made to her directly. She made 2 copies. She sent one by post to the Abilene sheriff and gave the second to Clarence Dodd with instructions to file it with the county clerk. Wade rode to Pueblo. In the 2 days he was gone, she did not consciously count the hours, but she was aware of them. She taught her classes. She sat with Dorothea on the porch in the evenings. She watched the hotel from the corner of her eye when she passed it on the main street, tracking Fletcher Dade's patterns the way you track weather. He came to her on the second evening, while she was walking back from the school. Not to the school this time, not in a place where there were witnesses. He fell into step beside her on a quiet section of road between the school and the main street, and his voice when he spoke was quiet and entirely without the pleasantness that was his usual costume. "You have been writing letters," he said. She kept walking. "I write many letters. I am a teacher. Letters are a significant part of literacy." "To Abilene," he said. She said nothing. "This is a mistake," he said, and his voice had gone to the place beneath the pleasantness, the cold, flat place that she had seen once before and had not forgotten. "You are a careful woman, Adelaide. You have been careful for 2 years. Do not stop being careful now." She stopped walking and turned to face him in the road, because she had decided she was done with his frame, his definition of careful, his idea of what she should and should not do with her own life. "I am going to testify," she said. "Whatever you do or do not do between now and then, I am going to testify to what I saw and what my husband told me. I have already put my written account in the hands of the sheriff and the county clerk, so the record exists regardless of what happens to me. And I would suggest to you, Mr. Dade, that you have spent a considerable amount of time and effort coming to this particular town, and you have accomplished none of what you came here for, and the situation is not going to improve for you." He looked at her for a long moment with those flat gray eyes, "You are making a very serious error in judgment," he said. "I have made errors in judgment before," she said. "Living in fear of you for 2 years was one of them. Good evening, Mr. Dade." She walked away and did not look back, and her hands were shaking the entire way to the millinery, but she was smiling. Wade came back from Pueblo on the evening of the second day, and he came directly to the millinery, and Dorothea let him in with a complete absence of surprise that suggested she had been observing the situation with considerably more attention than Adelaide had credited her. He brought her to the parlor and sat down across from her, and told her what Arthur Gaines had told him. There were 3 other ranchers in the county who had received legal challenges to their land rights in connection with the railroad survey corridor, all of them filed by a land management company in Denver that turned out, with minimal investigation, to be a company in which Fletcher Dade was a principal. 2 of them had already capitulated. 1 of them had not. Gaines was interested. He had also, Wade said, spoken to a territorial attorney named James Whitmore who had experience with railroad land cases, and who believed that Dade's legal challenges were based on a deliberately misread statute that any competent judge would dismiss, but that the dismissal required someone to actually bring the challenge to court. "Whitmore will take the case for the running-o," Wade said, "and for the other 2 ranchers who have not settled." She exhaled slowly. "That is very good news. It is going to take time," he said, "and Dade is going to push back, I know." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Did something happen while I was gone?" She told him about Dade finding her on the road. She told him everything Dade had said, and she told him what she had said in response, and by the time she finished he was leaning forward with his forearms on his knees and an expression that was carefully controlled but not entirely. "Are you all right?" he said. "I am all right." She looked at her hands. "I was frightened, but I was also, for the first time in a long time, not running from it. And that felt," she paused, "it felt like something I had forgotten was possible." He was looking at her with an expression that had stopped being controlled. That was simply what it was, and she looked back at him, and they were both very still in Dorothea's parlor with the lamp burning between them. "I need to tell you the rest," she said. "The things I did not tell you before." "You do not have to," he said. "Not for me." "I know I do not have to," she said. "That is why I want to." She told him about Henry. Not the edited version she had given Clarence Dodd, but the full truth, including the parts that were hardest to say. The fact that Henry had known what Dade was before he had witnessed anything, that he had done business with him, that the relationship between them had been complicated and not entirely clean, that Henry had been trying to get out of a situation that he had in part created, and that his death had been both a crime and, in some ways, the consequence of choices he had made. She told Wade that she had loved Henry imperfectly and been imperfectly loved in return, and that she had carried guilt about both of those things for 2 years. Wade listened to all of it without any expression on his face except attention. When she finished, he said, "Henry made his choices. Dade made his. None of what Dade did to Henry or to you is on you." "I know that," she said. "Logically, I know that. But you have been carrying it anyway." "Yes," he nodded once, the way he nodded when something settled into place. "You do not have to carry it alone," he said. She looked at him across the lamp and the table and the small, careful distance she had maintained between them for months and said, "I know. I am beginning to understand that. Fletcher Dade left Calder Creek in June. He did not leave voluntarily or gracefully. On the morning he left, Dade came to the main street of Calder Creek in his long black coat with his silver-mounted saddle already on the gray horse, and he stopped in front of the general store where Adelaide happened to be standing with Gideon Farr, and he looked at her for a long moment with an expression that was the last version of the threat, the one that says this is not finished even when it clearly is. She looked back at him without looking away. He rode out of town and did not come back. She stood on the boardwalk in the summer morning and breathed the air of Calder Creek, which smelled of dry grass and horses and the wood smoke from the blacksmith's fire. And she felt something she had been holding in her chest for 2 years loosen and begin to release. She went to the school. She taught her classes, and after the children had gone home in the afternoon and Tommy had stayed to clean the chalkboards, she said to him, "How is your uncle?" Tommy looked at her with the direct, knowing gaze of an 11-year-old. "You could ask him yourself," he said. She laughed. It was a real laugh, startled and genuine, and it felt like something waking up. What happened next happened slowly and honestly, and in the way of two people who have both been through enough that they do not need to rush it. Wade came to meet Tommy on Thursday as usual, and he walked her home as usual. And on this particular Thursday the walk was longer than usual, because he took a slight detour toward the creek that ran behind the mill. And they stood there in the summer evening with the water moving quietly and the cottonwood trees breathing in the warm air, and he said, carefully and without any performance, "I would like to call on you properly, if you would allow that." She looked at the creek, she looked at him. "I would allow that," she said. He called on her properly, which in Calder Creek in 1882 meant Sunday afternoons at Dorothea's parlor with the door open, and Dorothea conspicuously occupying herself at a distance, and Wednesday evenings at the Prairie Belle's lunch counter, and Saturday mornings, when he sometimes rode into town to do his business at the general store, and managed to time it so that she was also doing her business there. Dorothea watched all of it with the serene satisfaction of a woman who has been waiting for exactly this development. They talked about everything. She told him more about her childhood, about growing up in Ohio with a father who was a school teacher and a mother who died young, and the way she had inherited both of their qualities, her mother's stubbornness and her father's love of books. He told her about Missouri, about the farm he had grown up on that had been sold to pay debts after his father's death, and the decision to come west that had started as escape and turned into something he had not expected, into purpose. He was a man who had built his life deliberately, every piece of it, and she understood that kind of deliberateness because she had her own version of it, the version that looked like survival rather than ambition but was built from the same will. In August, on a hot evening after Sunday service, they walked together toward the creek, and this time the walk felt different in the way that things feel different when they have been building towards something and the something is here. They stood under the cottonwoods with the sound of the water and the long golden evening light, and she was looking at the creek when he said her name. She turned, and he was looking at her with an expression that was neither careful nor controlled, that was simply what it was, entirely and without reservation. "I love you," he said. "I am not asking you to say anything back to that. I just wanted you to know it." She stood very still. She could feel the evening on her face and the ground under her feet and the absolute realness of where she was and who she was standing next to. "Wade," she said. "Yes, I love you," she said. "I have been trying not to for approximately 6 months, and I am no longer interested in trying." He did not say anything. He simply reached out and took her hand, and they stood like that in the evening light with the water moving and the cottonwoods breathing, and it was the quietest and the most extraordinary moment she could remember. He kissed her for the first time on the walk back, on the road between the creek and the main street, in the late blue light with the first stars coming out, and it was the kind of kiss that does not need to be anything other than what it is, unhurried and honest, and the beginning of something. Dorothea, when Adelaide arrived back at the millinery, took one look at her face and said, "Well, it is about time," and went back to her knitting. The territorial court dismissed Fletcher Dade's claims against the running in September. The other two ranchers also received favorable rulings. James Whitmore wrote a brief note of congratulations to Wade that was 3 sentences long and entirely professional. And Adelaide pressed it flat between the pages of a book, because she felt it deserved to be kept. The arrest warrant for Dade in connection with the Porter Reeves murder was executed in late September. He was found in Santa Fe, New Mexico Territory, and extradited to Kansas. The trial was set for the spring of 1883. Adelaide wrote her full testimony carefully and sent it to the Abilene court, and agreed to travel there in April if her testimony in person was required. Wade said, without being asked, that he would take her. In October, on a Saturday afternoon when the trees along the creek had gone to gold, and the air had the particular cool clarity of a Colorado fall, Wade came to Dorothea's parlor and was shown to the sitting room and sat across from Adelaide in the formal way of a man who has something important to say and intends to say it properly. "I want to marry you," he said. She looked at him in the October light. "I know I do not have a great deal to offer compared to some men," he said, and she could see that despite his steadiness he was not entirely calm, that this cost him something, which made her love him more. "I have a ranch and a debt and a nephew who draws on his slate, and I work 6 days a week, and I am not always easy to live with because I am private, and sometimes I do not talk enough. But I love you and I will not stop, and I would spend the rest of my life making sure you knew it." She thought about everything she had run from, and everything she had found in the running. This town and this man and this life she had built with her own hands in a place where nobody had known her name. She thought about the version of herself who had arrived on a sorrel mare with $40 in her hem and a past she could not say out loud, and the version of herself sitting here now in full possession of her own story. "Yes," she said. He let out a breath that had been held for some time. "Yes," she said again, and she was smiling, genuinely and completely. "I will marry you, Wade Olson." He reached across the table and took her hand, and his grip was the same as it had been the very first time, firm and brief and respectful, except that this time he did not let go. They were married in November at the church that leaned slightly to the west, in a ceremony conducted by the Reverend Miles Carver, who was brief and sincere, and had a fine voice for the occasion. Dorothea stood up with Adelaide and cried freely at several points without any embarrassment. Tommy stood with Wade and wore his good jacket, and looked at various points terrified and proud and pleased in the specific rotating combination of those emotions that belongs to 11-year-old boys at important moments. Gideon Farr attended. Clarence Dodd attended. Samuel Greer attended with his wife Martha, who had brought an enormous and excellent cake. Most of the town attended, in fact, because in a town of 200 people, a wedding of people you admire is not something you miss. Adelaide wore her dark blue dress, the one she had worn to her interview with the town council, because it was her best dress and she had decided she liked the symmetry of it, beginning in this place in this dress, and beginning this next thing in it too. When the Reverend Carver said to Wade, "You may kiss your bride," Wade cupped her face in his large calloused hands and kissed her with a gentleness that was the most complete expression she had ever witnessed of what a person can mean to another person. And when they turned to face the assembled people of Calder Creek, she felt, for the first time in her adult life, entirely and without reservation at home. She moved to the running O. The room above the millinery was returned to Dorothea with real gratitude on both sides, and Dorothea gave Adelaide a quilt she had made herself as a wedding present, a beautiful one in blues and greens, which Adelaide put on the bed in the room that was now their room, in the house that was now her house, on the ranch that was now her home. She kept teaching. There had been a brief and somewhat amusing discussion with the town council about whether a married woman could continue as schoolteacher, and Adelaide had addressed it by presenting herself at the council meeting and explaining clearly that she was the best qualified person for the position, that the children knew her and trusted her, and that she intended to keep the position until she chose not to. The council, faced with this argument delivered in Adelaide Eston Olsen's particular combination of calm precision and complete inflexibility, agreed. Tommy's life changed considerably. His father, Cal, to his credit and somewhat to everyone's surprise, responded to the stability that had entered his son's world with a corresponding effort toward his own, and the drinking became occasional rather than constant, and he began showing up at the running on weekends to help with fencing and branding, and the relationship between him and Wade, which had been complicated by grief and worry, began to move toward something easier. Tommy himself flourished. With a home at the running on weekends and the after-school hours with Adelaide during the week, he had the steady structures his nature required, and his drawings of horses evolved into detailed landscapes of the Colorado plains that were genuinely extraordinary, and Adelaide kept several of them pinned to the wall above her writing table. In the spring of 1883, Adelaide and Wade traveled to Abilene together for the trial. She gave her testimony over 2 days, clearly and without trembling, in the quiet voice she used when she was most certain of herself. Wade sat in the gallery of the courtroom every day, in the 3rd row, steady and present, and every time she looked up from the witness chair she could see him there. Fletcher Dade was convicted of the murder of Porter Reeves and sentenced to 20 years at the federal penitentiary in Kansas. He made no statement at sentencing and left the courtroom with the last version of his expression, the controlled one, the one that had no more power over her. She walked out of that courtroom into the Kansas sunshine, and Wade was waiting for her on the steps, and she went to him and he put his arms around her, right there on the courthouse steps, and she pressed her face against his collar and let out 2 years of breath. "It is done," he said against her hair. "It is done," she agreed. They rode home to Colorado and to Calder Creek and to the Running O, and the spring was coming in across the plains, green and warm and full of possibility, and she thought with her face turned into the wind that this was what it felt like to be going somewhere rather than leaving somewhere, and it felt entirely different. The summer of 1883 was the warmest in recent memory. The Running O prospered. Samuel Greer and Martha celebrated the birth of a son. Tommy won a prize at the county fair for a drawing of the creek in autumn light that made Clarence Dodd, who judged the art competition, pull off his hat and rub his head in appreciation. And in September, Adelaide discovered she was expecting a child. She told Wade on a Sunday morning while he was mending a section of paddock fence, because she had decided that important news should be delivered in the normal context of life, rather than in specially arranged moments. And she simply walked out to the paddock and said, "I am going to have a baby." He stopped mending the fence. He turned and looked at her, and his face did the thing it did sometimes when he was moved beyond his usual steadiness, when something got past the careful private exterior and landed fully in the open, and it was her favorite expression he had, the one she had seen first on the porch of the Running O on that evening of fire and surrender, the one that was simply and entirely real. He crossed the paddock in 4 steps and held her face in his hands and looked at her for a long moment without saying anything. "Wade," she said. "I know," he said. "I know." And he pulled her close and held her with his face in her hair, and she could feel his heartbeat, strong and steady, and she put her hands against his back and held on. The baby arrived in April of 1884, 2 weeks late and entirely worth the wait. It was a boy, and they named him James, after James Whitmore, the territorial attorney who had saved the running O and who was, Adelaide felt, owed at least a name. James Olson came into the world at the running O with the help of Dr. Elias Prout, who smelled of tobacco and was, in this instance, entirely reliable, and also Dorothea Hatch, who had driven herself out from town on her own initiative in the manner of a woman who intends to be useful at an important moment. Dorothea cried again, with the same complete freedom and lack of embarrassment that had characterized her performance at the wedding. Wade held his son for the first time with the same quality of stillness that characterized all his important moments. A man who is most completely himself when the thing he is experiencing is most completely real. You already are. James learned to walk in the fall and to talk in the winter, and to follow his father around the yard by the time he was 18 months old. And he was a serious and observant child who had his mother's eyes and his father's unshakable calm and both of their stubbornness, which kept life at the running O interesting. Tommy, 12 and then 13, was an excellent older cousin, protective and occasionally bossy, and he taught James to hold a pencil before the boy could reliably hold a cup, which led to some interesting results on the kitchen floor. Adelaide was not particularly troubled by this. In the summer of 1885, 2 things happened that felt like completion. The first was that the new railroad line through the county was completed, running, as surveyed, across the southeastern corner of the running O. Wade had negotiated the right-of-way agreement himself, with James Whitmore's assistance, at a rate that was fair and then a little more than fair, and the income from the agreement cleared the ranch's remaining debt and put money aside for improvements. The first train ran in July, and the whole town of Calder Creek turned out to watch it, which was one of those moments that belongs to a specific time and place. The sound of that engine coming across the plains, the smoke rising, the sense of a world changing, and the people standing in the sunshine watching it happen. Adelaide stood beside Wade with James on her hip, and Tommy stood on Wade's other side, nearly 14 now and nearly as tall, and she looked at the train and then at the people around her and felt the specific satisfaction of knowing she had been part of something, that she had contributed to the protection of this place and these people, that the fight she had been afraid to begin for 2 years had been worth beginning. The second thing that happened in the summer of 1885 was that she found out she was expecting again. She told Wade in the paddock again, on a Sunday morning again, because she believed in consistency. He laughed. It was a real, full, deeply happy laugh, and it startled her the way it always did when he laughed like that, because he was a private man and his full happiness was a thing she never quite got used to seeing, even though she had been the primary cause of it for 2 years. Good, he said. James needs someone to teach. He is 2 years old, she said. Better to start early, Wade said, and went back to his fence, and she stood in the warm morning and shook her head and smiled at the grass. The second baby was a girl. She arrived in February of 1886, in the same bedroom with the same Dr. Prout and the same Dorothea. And they named her Ruth, after Wade's sister, which made him quiet and grateful in the way of a man who carries his grief privately, but feels the acknowledgement of it deeply. Ruth was nothing like James. Where James was calm and watchful, Ruth was loud and immediate and had opinions about everything from the time she was 3 months old. She had Adelaide's dark hair and her own set of features that were entirely her own, and she had, from the beginning, a quality of absolute certainty about what she wanted, and how she intended to get it that her mother recognized with a mixture of sympathy and amusement. Tommy was 17 when Ruth was born and had begun to talk about going to art school in Denver, which was a conversation Wade handled with the careful thoughtfulness of a man who takes a young person's dreams seriously. They talked it through over weeks, Tommy's talent and the cost of schooling and the distance and what it would mean for Cal and for the running O. And in the end, it was decided that Tommy would go to Denver for a year, to the art school there that had been established in 1882, and that if it was what he wanted and what he proved capable of, he would go further. It was the right decision for exactly the right reasons. And when Tommy rode out in the autumn of 1886 on the horse Wade had given him for his 17th birthday, he looked back once at the running O and then forward at the road, which Adelaide thought was exactly the correct proportion. He sent letters with drawings in them, astonishing drawings of Denver and the mountains and the people he was meeting, and Adelaide put several of them on the schoolhouse wall alongside the children's work, and the children thought Tommy Olson was something remarkable. The years moved in the good way, the way of years that are full of small daily things and occasional large ones, and the steady accumulation of a life built on something real. James grew into a boy with a passion for horses, and a gift for the quiet, patient work of training them that made Samuel Greer, who had an expert eye, say once to Wade that the boy had a natural connection with animals that was rare and worth cultivating. Wade began teaching him in earnest at 7, and by 9 James could work a green horse with a steadiness that was considerably beyond his years. He was going to be, in the manner of these things, better at it than his father, which was exactly what Wade wanted. Ruth grew into a girl who asked approximately 40 questions per day, many of them about things that her teachers and parents had to think carefully about before answering. She was in Adelaide's school by the time she was 5, which created an interesting dynamic that Ruth resolved by being an excellent student and a constant challenge in equal measure. She wanted to know how everything worked. She wanted to know why the railroad worked and how Dr. Pruitt's medicines worked, and how the land office filed claims and what the territorial legislature did. She drove Wade to the county library in Pueblo twice a year to get new books for her, and he went without complaint, which was one of the things Adelaide loved most about him. In 1889, Colorado became the 38th state in the Union, and Calder Creek celebrated with a dinner on the main street, and a band that was not entirely in tune, and an enormous amount of enthusiasm that covered the tuning problem adequately. Wade stood at the edge of the celebration with Adelaide beside him, James holding his hand, Ruth already somewhere in the crowd asking questions, and he looked out at the town he had been part of for 12 years and said quietly, "When I came here I thought this was the edge of the world." "And now," she said, "now it is the center of it," he said. She leaned against his shoulder and he put his arm around her, and they stood like that in the lantern light of the Colorado evening while the music played imperfectly, and the people of Calder Creek danced on the wide main street under the stars. Tommy came home from Denver in 1890 for a summer visit, a young man now of 22, and he brought a portfolio of work that stunned them all with its beauty and its maturity. He was going, he told them, to New York the following year, where there were galleries and commissions and a larger world for his particular kind of seeing. Cal Olson, sober now for 3 years with the intermittent help of the church and the consistent help of his brother, sat at the running kitchen table and looked at his son's paintings and cried, quietly, and everyone at the table pretended not to notice in the way that love sometimes requires. Fletcher Dade served his sentence. The information reached Calder Creek in 1893, when a letter from the Abilene sheriff informed Adelaide that Dade had died in the federal penitentiary of pneumonia in November of 1892. She read the letter twice and then folded it and put it in the fire. Not with hatred or satisfaction. Simply as the final closing of a door she had been holding shut for more than a decade. There was nothing left to guard against. The danger she had carried in her body for 10 years was finally, completely gone. She told Wade that evening, sitting at the kitchen table after the children were in bed. He read her face the way he always had, the way that had never stopped catching her off guard in its accuracy and its care. "How do you feel?" he asked. She thought about it honestly, the way she thought about most things. "Free," she said. "Completely free, for the first time since 1880. He reached across the table and took her hand, and they sat in the lamplight of the running kitchen, in the house they had built their life in, and she felt the last heavy thing she had been carrying lift away into the air and go. James turned 10 in the spring of 1894, and the running was given its best year on record. The cattle prices were good, the weather was kind, and Wade hired 2 additional hands and began the expansion of the barn he had been planning for 3 years. Samuel Greer, who had been the quiet backbone of the ranch for 18 years, was given a partnership interest, which he accepted with the dignified brevity of a man who had long since stopped being surprised by Wade Olson's fairness. Ruth, at 9, discovered the territorial library in Pueblo and became a regular correspondent with the librarian there, a woman named Frances Crowder, who wrote back with book recommendations and occasional observations about territorial politics that Ruth reported at the dinner table with the authority of a small expert. She had decided, she told her parents that year, that she wanted to become a lawyer. Adelaide did not say this was unusual, because she had taught long enough to know that the moment you tell a child their dream is unusual is the moment you begin taking it from them. She said, "Then you will need to know mathematics and history and literature very well, and you should start immediately." Ruth went back to her books. James, at 10, said he wanted to spend his life with horses, which was not exactly a decision requiring new information, given that he had essentially been saying it since he could speak. Wade looked at him across the dinner table and said, "Then the running is going to need more horses," which was, Adelaide thought, the most perfect thing he could have said. On the evening of their 12th anniversary, in November of 1894, they sat together on the porch of the running the same porch she had stood on the evening she had said the truest and the most frightened thing she had ever said, and the stars were out over Colorado in the particular abundance they have in clear fall nights, more than you can count, more than you can reason with, simply there in their thousands. She looked out at the yard, and the barn and the paddock beyond it, dark now in the late evening, the shapes of horses moving against the fence. She thought about the woman who had arrived at this porch on a sorrel mare and had said, "I cannot be your reason to stay." She remembered the exact quality of her fear that evening, the fear that wanting him and being wanted would be another version of the things that had gone wrong before. That love would be another thing that cost her. She had been wrong about that. She had been wrong in the most necessary and complete way. Wade's hand found hers on the porch railing, large and familiar and entirely certain, and she turned to look at him in the starlight. "You are thinking about that night," he said. "He always knew." "I am," she said. "Are you sorry?" She looked at the stars. She looked at the ranch. She looked at him. "That I said it?" she asked. "No, I needed to say it. It was true at the time. I believed every word of it. And now?" She smiled, and it was the full, real smile that she had been afraid to give him for so long, that she had stopped being afraid to give him somewhere in the first winter of their marriage and had been giving him ever since. "Now," she said, "I am deeply grateful that you did not listen to me." He laughed, low and quiet, and put his arm around her, and she leaned into the solid warmth of him and looked out at the Colorado sky. "I was never going to listen to that particular piece of advice," he said. "I know," she said. "I think I was counting on it." She would teach for another 20 years, until the town had grown enough that the school needed 2 teachers, and the new one was half her age and very good. And she stayed on as something between a teacher and a guide for 3 more years after that, because she found she was not ready to give up the chalk dust smell of the schoolroom or the faces of children, just learning that they were capable of more than they knew. Wade would run the running for 30 years more and eventually take James in as his partner. The two of them side by side on the land in a way that was different from the way Wade had once stood alone on it. Better in the way that things with the right people in them are always better than the same things alone. Tommy would become a painter of some renown, showing work in Denver and New York and eventually in Philadelphia. And he would come home to the running every summer until the end of his father's life, and afterward, because home is the thing you carry with you but also the thing you return to. And he had learned that from the woman who had come to Calder Creek on a cracked saddle and put down roots. Ruth would become a lawyer eventually, after a long determined path that required more persistence than most people could have sustained. And she would practice in Pueblo and later in Denver. And she would win cases that mattered for people who had not had anyone stand for them before, which was, Adelaide thought, the finest possible use of the stubbornness she had been born with. James would breed horses, quarter horses, and later some thoroughbred lines, and the running would become known across 3 states for the quality of what it produced. And James would be the kind of man his father was, steady and direct and entirely trustworthy. And he would find a woman with her own version of fire and good sense, and they would build their own particular version of a good life. And on a fall evening in 1895, when the stars were out and the children were older, and the ranch was quiet and she and Wade were sitting on the same porch where it had all begun, she thought about all of it, the whole long running thread of it, fear and flight and a strange town and a man who had stood on her porch steps and looked up at her and refused, with complete gentleness and absolute certainty, to accept the version of the story she had been trying to tell. She squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. The stars over Colorado were uncountable, enormous, ancient, and entirely indifferent to the small, warm light burning in the window of the running which was not a grand thing in the history of the world, but was, in every way that mattered, the most important place she had ever stood. She was exactly where she wanted to be. She had been, for 12 years, entirely and without reservation, home,